We all have a duty to act, even if we are not brave, and let me tell you, I am not naturally brave. In my case, acting means not abandoning language, not abandoning classics, and doing my best always to be a precise, compassionate, and honest teacher and storyteller to those who will listen. And the young listeners will, God willing, grow up remembering what I taught them and pass on, in turn, the best of my lessons and stories to their students and to their children. This is what Dreher calls cultural memory. This is tradition. This is education.
And excited to hear both the agreement and disagreement over what Rod has outlined. This first panel is going to be exploring the topic of the argument that Rod makes around growing soft totalitarianism in education. And by that, we are going to be exploring at all levels from K-12 through academia. And I can't think of a better person to lead this conversation than our Edward Gaylord Chair and Professor of Public Policy, Ted Mcallister. Ted, Ted is a historian and teaches many of our foundational Great Books courses here at the School of Public Policy. We're excited, relevant to the subject of this panel. Ted has recently filmed a 4-part short course on the roots of education policy with Dr. Margarita Mooney from Princeton Seminary, and very excited to be releasing that fairly soon. Ted brings a background not only in history, but also philosophy, and teaches courses here not only in American history, but also the philosophical principles undergirding our education system. And so with that, please join me in welcoming Dr. Ted Mcallister.
I'm struck by how strange this conference is. Most academic conferences are pretty mild-mannered, but I come today, quite frankly, with a kind of intensity, both intellectual and emotional, that I'm not seeking to hide from you. I suspect there are people among us who are going to argue with the premise of the conference, and then there are others who are going to offer, I hope, some challenges to the offering a kind of compromise view about how we should approach these things. So those should all be heard, but I think in this kind of conference also, the intensity of feeling at this moment, at this time in our history, is also warranted. In fact, I kept thinking of the movie you've all seen, if you're of a certain age, Network, in 1976, which is pretty much the keynote for what I have to say. I'm mad as hell, and I'm not going to take it anymore. But there are others who are going to be mad at me. And so I hope to hear from them as well. The panel will be a conversation, and I don't have any idea where it's going to go. I'm going to offer some framing questions that we may or may not discuss. Then I'm going to introduce our panelists, who will have a few minutes to introduce some thoughts, and then we will go to a conversation. And we will end with some questions from the audience. Pete, did you tell them about the card that they? Okay, you'll notice that in your package you have a card that you can fill out to have that for questions. Those will be collected, and from those we'll read the questions that will go to the panelists. Today, education is clearly at the top of the institutional wars of our time. But what we are fighting about, what has upset so many of us, is well downstream, coming from generations ago, at least 2. Most of us whose common sense and common decency have been violated in what we have experienced in the last several years lack the deeper knowledge necessary to fight for first principles in matters of education. Therefore, how much of our challenge is an issue of courage, and how much of it is connected to a proper formation that comes from education oriented around the pursuit of truth? Do we have the historical, cultural, moral knowledge to mount a real defense of American principles? Seems to me an open question. Rod makes reference to the anti-culture. Education in America today is largely anti-culture. The primary task seems to be to undermine healthy historical memory, to assault the institutions that most define our culture and the larger civilization to which we belong. The anti-cultural task of most elite institution aims to cut people off from the civilizational inheritance to which they're owed, to prevent them from having the resources of free people, to undermine gratitude in favor of resentment and hatred, all of which empowers transformation. The products of our educational system are taught to hate what they have been given and who they are, and they develop irrational passions for simple, pure, abstract ideas and visions that in practice close one off from truth, from the textured, complex, empirically messy truths that give to our lives purposes both worldly and divine. What can education, properly understood, do to respond to this problem? Is not education, properly speaking, pursuit of truth? How do we return education to the pursuit of truth? Is there a pedagogy of living in truth? Is there a way of educating the young and the college age on how to live in truth? And if so, what does that look like? What are the various phases of education appropriate to this task? What are the sentiments, habits, and dispositions that are not yet well formed from a lack of experience that we have to address with the proper pedagogy? What conditions have made it possible going to a diagnosis? What conditions have made it possible for so much of education today to be about propagating false reality, lies? What theory of the human, what mass technologies, what social order and power relationships have made deep and widespread lying about everyday reality possible? How did we let this happen? Knowing that might be part of our proper response. Finally, two actually I want to put in the air before we leave, before we go to our panel. To the degree that education is disconnected from what we broadly call the spiritual quest for truth and is replaced by valorizing knowledge as determined by authority, science, or experts, or whatever, the process of education prepares people for tyranny in special and direct ways. Our educational systems have been preparing us for tyranny for a couple of generations. The question is the character of the American people capable of resisting it at some deeper level? Finally, Rod notes in his book, The Rise of the Therapeutic, in tandem with the authoritarianism of our time. This connection between the therapeutic understanding of life and authoritarianism seems particularly clear in education, and particularly insidious. When you drove on campus, you saw, I'm sure, banners that say, you belong here, you are loved here, all kinds of language of belonging and caring, all of which is put to the task of a special kind of tyranny. And so to address the role of a kind of therapeutic understanding of the human might also be part of our inquiry. Whether we go to more diagnosis or whether we go to prescriptions, our panelists have a wide array of experiences and backgrounds to address these issues. I will be going in this order, so I will introduce them very briefly. You should be able to go to the website to find more thorough biographies of them, but I'm going to just give you a sense of where they come from. Mary Barkey, who will be our first to respond, was elected to the Orange County Board of Education in 2018, where she currently serves as the board president. Mary also works for the California Policy Center on their parent union, CLEO. Mary is on the board of directors of the Cypress Chamber of Commerce and ambassador for the Los Alamitos Chamber of Commerce. Next to her is Joshua Katz. Joshua is the Kotzen Professor of the Humanities and Professor of Classics at Princeton University, as well as a faculty associate of the James Madison Program in American Ideals and Institutions. The holder of degrees in linguistics from Yale, Oxford, and Harvard. He has taught at Princeton since 1998. As I suspect he put in his bio, of unfortunate necessity, he finds himself wading ever more into contemporary hot-button social political issues with recent publications in things like First Things, Law and Liberty, National Review, and so forth. Lastly is Habi Jain, who was born and raised in a small village in China. She's a doctoral student in political science at Purdue. She holds a master's in public policy from 2017 from Pepperdine University. In her spare time, she writes for Law and Liberty, The Imaginative Conservative, The American Mind, and The Wall Street Journal. So let's begin with Mary and your opening comments.
All right, well, I'm honored to be here today amongst all of you. What surprises most people is my background. It's not in education. Everyone assumes that because I'm on the County Board of Education, I know a lot about education. Well, I've learned a lot in the last 3.5 years, but my background is actually finance. The closest I came to education was I, for a short time, taught ESL. And I also have 2 great kids. So if you have kids and you care about what's going on, then you know a lot about education, probably more than you want to know some days. So I was volunteering for the California Policy Center, a nonpartisan think tank, and they suggested that I run for the Orange County Board of Education. And I said, really? What is the Orange County Board of Education? It's kind of embarrassing, but 3.5 years ago, I did not know what the Orange County Board of Education was, what they did, what their jurisdiction was. So I researched it, and I found that it actually was a pretty important role. It would provide choice for children, so children would be trapped by their zip codes. By being on the county board, you're an appeals board, so you can overturn every district that says, no, we don't want a charter school. We don't want the children in our neighborhood to have choices. You can also overturn inter-district transfers and let a child move to a school that's better suited. You can let parents decide what's best for their children rather than a district or a government agency. So I thought it was a worthy cause. And I watched a movie called Waiting for Superman. If you want a good cry and you haven't seen it, you have to watch that. That really sealed the deal. And I said, all right, I'm up for the challenge. I ran for office for the first time. I was actually elected, walking about 65 miles a week, and won by a short margin, just about 5%, doing all that. But it's been an honor to be there. I've learned so much. When I first went on the board, we'd gotten through Common Core, and I knew that didn't do much good for our kids. You know, suddenly 2 and 2 didn't always equal 4, which seemed kind of odd. But I came in right when it was sex ed, and I was learning things on that board that I don't think I'm too prude, but I'd never heard of. And I thought, wow, and they're teaching our young children about this. So, you know, we went from that to unlimited genders, you know. The next thing that happened was we decided to close schools to the class of people that were probably at the least amount of risk. There was science that told us that kids were not at a big risk, yet we were closing the schools. Why were we doing that? You know, I started to see a little bit of a pattern, fought hard to get the schools back open, and eventually we did. We sued the governor, we scared him, and he sort of opened them in Orange County anyway. The next thing that happened, they hadn't dumbed down our kids enough, they brought out critical race theory. And you know, you heard from government and everybody in districts and superintendents in the state that critical race theory, that doesn't exist. No, maybe in the college where, you know, it's optional. Oh, really? But then yet a couple months later, the head of the NEA, the largest teachers union in California, said, yeah, we're teaching CRT and we're going to teach it in all 50 states to all 14,000 districts. So lies, talk about lies. Oh my goodness, it's unbelievable. So the next thing we did at the county board was we decided to educate the community. Even though we didn't have jurisdiction over their curriculum, we could educate them. And we had 2 great critical race theory forums. You can go on our website, the Orange County Board of Education, and watch them. And James Lindsay, he was my favorite speaker. He came all the way from Tennessee. He owed one of our other speakers a favor, so she used her favor up on me, Dr. Wenyan Wu, and James Lindsay came, and somebody said, so how is it that one day a Harvard professor is saying CRT doesn't exist, and the next day a union leader is saying, of course it exists, and we're going to keep teaching it. And he said, you know what? They're all liars. So that's the theme, liars. And what he suggested, you know, I said, all right, tell everybody what they should do. He said, fire them. And that's what you're really seeing across this nation, across the state, across Orange County, is you're seeing school board members being fired. They're being recalled. They're going to be run out of town at the next election. And you're going to see people, I hope, run for office who really care about the children, community members, parents, grandparents. You don't even have to have kids. You just have to care about our next generation. You have to care about the world. You have to care about not living by lies, by living by truth. So I'm thrilled that God put me on the county board. I didn't know what I was getting into. I thought I was going to approve a few charter schools. It's turned out to be a lot more, but I'm happy to be doing what I'm doing. And I'm thrilled to be here with you guys today and to have a conversation.
Good afternoon. I'm a linguist, a classicist, and a professor at Princeton University. Until recently, that sentence described me all too well. I was an unmarried agnostic who cared about little other than his job and who might as well have lived in his office. I was a true believer in elite education. No longer. As many of you will know, my world came crashing down last year. Well, not my whole world. I am a Christian now, and I married the love of my life this past summer. But it is hard to speak with pride about being a linguist, a classicist, and a professor at Princeton when, just like that, virtually all linguists and classicists in the country stopped acknowledging my existence, and when the vast majority of current Princetonians want me fired. If you don't know what this is all about, that's fine. This is not the hour for nuanced discussion of my situation, which Rod Dreher, bless you, Rod, has done much to bring to national attention. What it is time for is discussion of the future of education in a world where living by lies has become the elite new normal. I'm a linguist because I care about language, and I'm a classicist because I care about tradition. To use Dreher's turn of phrase, it is an ideological abuse of language, and of tradition for that matter, for the president of Princeton to claim that the university over which he presides is fundamentally racist. Then, when the federal government raises the specter of violations of Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 to the potential tune of tens of millions of dollars in fines, for the president to say that, of course, the university isn't actually racist, and then, when a new administration in Washington comes in and it's safe to repeat this sort of lie, for him to forge ahead as a major priority with the implementation of practices of anti-racism, which we all know is the new term for racism. And it is an ideological abuse of tradition, and of language too, when what was until recently arguably the best classics department in the country decides, in part because of the anti-racist agenda, that its undergraduate majors need not take even a single semester of either Latin or ancient Greek over their 4 years. Now, Dreher's book, Live Not by Lies, does not have much to say about education in the institutional sense. What Dreher brings out compellingly is the way in which knowledge thrives in small settings, in tight-knit families of faith, and in groups of unrelated and sometimes very differently motivated people who nonetheless find kinship in truth. A cell of 10 dissenters is far, far more powerful than an isolated individual. Language thrives in community, and since tradition literally means passing across, that is to say, across generations, it makes little sense to think of historical memory as a solitary pursuit either. It takes an optimist or a person of deep faith to light a small flame in the darkness and imagine that it might become a conflagration that will ultimately take down an evil regime. I do not know how quickly we can stop the lies that are invading the ever less united states, lies on the right as well as on the left, I stress, but let us take hope in the new University of Austin, a nonpartisan, non-sectarian institution dedicated to truth, on whose board of advisors I sit, which has received extensive media coverage since its existence was announced yesterday morning. Still, we need more than new temples of learning, and I take particular comfort and inspiration from Dreher's description of seminars in the humble, private homes of Eastern European dissidents, from what Václav Benda called the parallel polis. A number of current and recent students at Princeton have told me, a bit sadly, in view of the supposed greatness of the university and the oceans of money on which it sails, a bit sadly that their greatest educational experiences in town have come not from for-credit classes, but instead from seminars sponsored by one or another outside group. Often the Witherspoon Institute, which owns a lovely house just a few blocks from campus. Witherspoon promotes the academic and pedagogical examination of the moral foundations of political, philosophical, and social thought. And last year I taught 2 seminars for them, one on Plato's dialogue on language, the Cratylus, and the other on the archaic Greek poet Hesiod. The students, most of them undergraduates, but some graduates as well, were exceptionally engaged, eager to learn, and unafraid to take risks by speaking their mind. These are seminars as they are supposed to be. They're filled with attention to detail rather than painting the world with a broad brush. They're filled with knowledge and argument and laughter. There's nothing clandestine about these seminars, which are advertised and open to all, but they are nonetheless something of a secret. And I promise you this, if I leave Princeton, my wife and I will open our home to students who prize cross-generational contact and truth. Throughout the book, Dreher exhorts us to see, judge, act. If you are associated with an educational institution, whether as an employee, a parent, or a taxpayer, and you do not see the problem, God help you, and you probably don't live in Virginia. If you do see the problem, you must judge it. The hard part is moving from judgment to action. We all have a duty to act, even if we are not brave, and let me tell you, I am not naturally brave. In my case, acting means not abandoning language, not abandoning classics, and doing my best always to be a precise, compassionate, and honest teacher and storyteller to those who will listen. And the young listeners will, God willing, grow up remembering what I taught them and pass on in turn the best of my lessons and stories to their students and to their children. This is what Dreher calls cultural memory. This is tradition. This is education.
Hello. Please forgive me for reading my script. I have a very good excuse. I'm a foreigner, and speaking to a large crowd in a second language is very dreadful. So first, I want to say I feel extremely honored sitting on the same panel with Ms. Barkey and Professor Katz, and of course our Professor Mcallister, the greatest. Unlike my distinguished panelists, I'm a person of no achievements or credentials. I can therefore only hope that my experiences of attending both Chinese and American schools and my observations of the ever-increasing degradation of the American university from my vantage point will provoke some thoughts and reactions. I will also share a personal lament and issue a trigger warning. My words are assertive and could be regarded as offensive. You've been warned. At the age of 16, I came across a book in my hometown. It explains that the American university is a special place. Unlike its Chinese counterpart, devoted to the cultivation of the enduring longings of the human soul, to assist in man's hunger to know, to understand, and to seek truth is its highest mission. The longing for its spot in the American school tormented me for decades. How could I not yearn for a place where students were challenged to think the unthinkable, to question convention, and to debate each other on ideas, when I had been imprisoned for years in the Chinese classroom, where all subjects were stripped of all elements of beauty and imagination and left with only naked utility? I remained empty and puzzled all the years I lived in China, because looking around, I saw what I call post-totalitarian, that is, post-Mao society, that was cynical, calculating, and deceptive, a culture that had no respect or use for truth, but only money and power. I wanted to escape, and I finally made my way out in 2015 when I attended Pepperdine. I felt I had died and gone to heaven during the 2 years at SPP. I had the best teachers one can hope for. But in a way, SPP also sheltered me from the larger reality in the rest of the Western world. It is in 2017 when I was first alerted to the attack on freedom of speech through the Jordan Peterson saga. I was then stunned to see social justice warriors sometimes physically attack conservative speakers for alleged hate speech, i.e. the speech they hate. The administration shut down events or disinvited speakers to placate the angry mob, or so they wished. I could not believe all that was happening in a civilization that had in the past nurtured liberal thinkers such as John Stuart Mill. In 2019, when I was at the second year of my current program in political science, I started a research project on political tolerance. I saw many disturbing reports suggesting that the majority of college students do not support the First Amendment, while willing to censor speeches they regard as offensive. Meanwhile, within the academic circle, professors were talking about white supremacy. Nobody offered a definition or supplied evidence, but all cultural elites were patterning the narrative to college students and media consumers. Now, in retrospect, the so-called white supremacy served as a stepping stone for the ascendancy of secular religions. By that, I mean the ideology of intersectionality that preach competitive victimhood, or DER or CRT that preach division, hatred, and revenge. Then in 2020, I was flabbergasted to see the American replication of the Chinese Cultural Revolution on full blast. The stunning similarity of the rhetoric and tactics between BLM rioters who raise their fists and red guards who hold high the red book is just chilling. In my first essay published in November of last year, I wrote, "One must wonder how long will it take before the revolution creeps into households and regularly has people turn on each other." Little did I know that it didn't take long before the so-called cancel culture blossomed this year. Then there is the personal lament. I fled from a hard totalitarianism, i.e. Xi Jinping's China, only to land in an emerging soft one, where, just like the former, thinking is discouraged, dissent persecuted, and ideological loyalty the prerequisite for flourishing in the institution of higher learning. I want to end my remarks with a warning. Many already know that totalitarian state takes away freedom, but they have yet to learn that it also destroys everything in humanity that is noble, decent, and ethical. Thank you.
Before we get to the panel discussion, I want to remind you again that you have cards you can use to write out questions, and they'll be collected on the edge, and you can pass them down. So please feel free to start doing that. So a number of questions that come to my mind in the midst after listening to your remarks, and I encourage you to guide us where you want to. But I have two broad ones that I think might be worth starting with. One, it goes back to Rod's wondering, or maybe it was stronger than, maybe it was a claim that Christians today, or people more generally, are not willing to suffer as they ought to for their faith. And I wonder if that is true in our experiences. My own sense is that we are that the necessary courage for taking back the America that has been stolen from us, particularly our history, is something that people are willing to do out of their experiences once they confront it in a direct way. I'm not sure that many people, until very recently, have confronted it. So one of the questions is, is the American character able to respond to this? But the more immediate one is a question about tactics. Should we be seeking to take back institutions? Mary, I think that's part of what you're about, right? Taking back institutions that have gone a certain direction. Or are we tasked, or should we be tasked with creating parallel institutions, such as Austin University, or other kinds of K through 12 schools, or homeschooling? Which combination of those, if you think it's both, should we be about? What are we called to, given the depth and the depth of the problem in the institutions that govern us, and the degree to which we find a staggering uniformity among elites, among their beliefs? What is their proper response? Take back or parallel institutions?
I'll start, I think, with K through 12, to start there. I think to take back. But I also believe in parallel institutions. I think during times now when you're seeing so many children indoctrinated, or as I say, being dumbed down, you're seeing parents do different things. Some parents have always homeschooled. Some as a result of watching what happened during the pandemic and getting a sight on what their education actually was or was not. Some kids were educated, many were not. And so I think parents have been creative, and some are now homeschooling. Some have moved on to charter schools. Some are starting their own schools. So I think improving what you have, but also building alongside, I think in the K-12 is probably what's appropriate. I think the most important thing is to be aware of what's going on, and to have our eyes wide open, and to not live by the lies, and to keep truth in front of our children, and to know what they're learning. And I think as long as we can, because many people, I've heard this for years, oh, kids get indoctrinated in college. You know what? Kids are indoctrinated when they're not even thinking about college. I've seen CRT in preschool. So I think that it's important as parents, guardians, those watching over younger ones, to really know what's going on and try and keep the truth in front of them.
So I would agree with all that. I would say that there are actually three types of institutions. They're the ones that are already existing. They're the ones that should perhaps come into being. And then there's perhaps a parallel universe out there. So I am entirely incapable of speaking about K-12 education, unfortunately. So let me just stick to colleges and universities and people of that age. I'm a strong believer in all three of these. I'm a strong believer in fixing institutions from within. One of my roles is connected to the so-called Foundation for Excellence in Higher Education, FIHE. If you don't know what that is, you might wish to look it up. And its mission is, quote, strengthening institutions, meaning educational institutions, from within. To be completely honest, I used to believe that that was an easier thing to do than I now believe, but I still think it's worth a try. I believe in the mission of FIHE. But, as you just heard, I also believe in the mission of creating new institutions like the one announced yesterday, the University of Austin. Again, to be entirely honest, a few years ago, I would have said that was a ridiculous idea, but we're not in the position we were in a few years ago, and I think that this is worth a try. But there is the third type of institution as well. That's the Benda Parallel Polis. How this works for people of college and university age is not entirely clear to me. What's the equivalent, as it were, of homeschooling? Well, maybe it isn't formal school. Maybe it's just actually having people to your home and talking with them as though they were civilized people, having them to dinners, having them to breakfasts, enjoying one another's company, telling stories, imparting age-old truths, arguing about things. I think that's important too. So in my view, all three.
Any ideas?
Yeah, I have a few words, and I first, I don't know if we can save the current existing institutions from within, because now I recall Alan Bloom wrote that book in 1989, is that right? And 20 years ago, the situation was quite dire, and of course now it's just, I don't even have words to describe the nightmare we're living in now. And I think in a way I favor the parallel institution, and I've heard lots of parallel, like a parallel economy, parallel education. Yeah, it can work, but then I cannot help but thinking about if we have a parallel universe, which means, America nowadays is so divided, and now we have a parallel systems, and how could the union exist in such a schizophrenia? Yeah, so that's my worry about a parallel universe.
One of Hobby's essays, I think it was an Imaginative Conservative, was about a family. What was the title of that essay?
A love letter to the parent, to a shout out to the Parent Avenue, living in Lafayette, Indiana.
And if you read that essay, one of the things that comes out quite beautifully is the degree to which this family is a kind of self-governing family. They take care of themselves. They are self-regulating, even as she has an essay where she talks about the youngest of them, or one of the youngest, who goes out fishing on his own, something that she could not imagine seeing in China without oversight, that people take care of themselves. Well, one of the assertions that I would make with response to my own question is that what Hobby experienced with that family and what she wrote about is actually very deep in America. That Americans are self-governing people at the level of character, the level of dispositions and sentiments, and that the opportunity is to find these situations where we can take, instead of being governed by experts or those who claim to know, we take ownership of the things most important to our lives, like our schools. So one simple way of putting it, particularly with what we now call public schools, they're not public, they're government schools. And the distinction is, private schools are public, right? Because if you go to a private school, you have to be responsive to the parents and to those people who are funding it. You have a responsibility to them, and there's a kind of relationship. But if you go to one of the government schools, they are being controlled by in our case, Sacramento and the Department of Education, who determines all kinds of things about what happens, but it's not tied to the community that says this is the kind of education we want in our schools. So the degree to which we start getting politically involved and taking over school boards is the first place to have what Tocqueville called that kind of schoolhouse of democracy, where you can actually have experiences of governing yourselves together. You work with others to say, well, what kind of school do we want? We are a public. What kind of school is appropriate to us? That does at least two things. It not only gives you a different a school in the process, and I don't think it requires the parents to be college educated to get the right kind of education for their kids. I trust their instincts rather deeply. I think they know what their kids need to get out of schools. So I can trust them to pursue that, but also they have to learn the art of working with others and crafting something, deliberating together, but also crafting something that wouldn't be there without them, and that experts could never create, and that actually serves to then produce children who come up in a system like that, where self-governance, self-rule, working with others, neighborliness, all of those virtues are cultivated. So you could sort of start by reclaiming the public. Right? Are there any responses before we go? Yeah.
Can I say something to that?
Yes.
I mean, we also have to reclaim the private. I'm not proud of this, but I had an absurdly elite education. Before I went to college, I went to a very fancy school in New York City for 13 years, from the kindergarten through 12th grade. This is one of the schools, and there are many that have been in the news this year for going completely crazy. My wife also attended one of those schools in New York City for 13 years. I don't want to speak for her, but I'm pretty sure that neither one of us would send our kids to either of those schools or any other private school in New York City at the moment either. And if in New York City the so-called elite public schools, also much in the news now, go down the drain as well, then God help us, because there will be no alternatives whatsoever. So I can't talk about public education at all, but the idea used to be that in New York and San Francisco and some other places, you could, if you were sufficiently wealthy and sufficiently snobbish and wanted that sort of thing, you could have that parallel alternative. And boy, is that over. And that's a very, very bad thing. So it's not the case that it's not government control over the private institutions, but wherever the control lies certainly isn't with sense.
Well, I think that is my original desire to go on the county board and to approve charter schools, was to create competition, because I knew the government schools were terrible places, and if they had competition, they might be more accountable. So that was the original drive, to go on the board to approve charter schools and give people some freedom.
Any questions that you want to address to the panel before I ask my next? I want to ask about technologies, particularly technologies that tend to abstract and isolate people. To what degree is the loneliness that Rod referred to earlier, and the difficulty in having meaningful conversations and meaningful connections, to what degree is it tied to the kinds of technologies that colonize our lives and that cause us to approach everything such as information as something to extract, and even the goals of education, which we used to think of as preparing people with the intellectual virtues to pursue truth, now seems to be about power and information, and it seems to be reinforced by various kinds of technologies that make it impossible or more difficult for people to understand they are part of a collective effort or communal effort in education. Do you see the technologies at work to be a part of the problem, and is there a response to it? Is there a redress?
A few words about technology. I think technology is truly the culprit behind this modern loneliness, alienation, and go back to that lovely parent platoon. I saw something that truly touched my heart. I mean, they are Catholic families, large families. They all do homeschooling, and they do not give their kids cell phones. And even the adults, they barely use cell phones. And when they spend lots of time with their family, with their neighbors, with their friends. And when they engage each other, they are fully present. That is just extraordinary. Nobody take out their cell phone to check the emails or text. And since the Catholics, they love festivals, and so they have lots of gatherings, and for hours, people fully engage each other, they are participating in each other's life and enriching each other's life. And I see true, fully humans in those lovely souls. And yeah, so it's for a few words about technology.
One of the questions that comes up connects with that is for hobby, that I actually am quite curious about your answer to. Having lived in China, we witnessed the beginning of the social credit system. My question to you is, what is your advice for Americans who are largely sleepwalking toward the social credit system? What are warning signs that you are seeing from your own vantage point that can inform Americans in this room about the credit system?
So my advice, my solution, is that
yes,
the question?
What advice do you have based on?
Oh gosh, I have no solutions. I'm a person who is not very interested in solving problems. Sorry to say that to Dean Peterson. I'm more interested in why. I just want to understand and go back to this question. For years, it really puzzles me. I don't understand why rugged individualist individual. I mean, we have different individualism. And so, I mean, there is one version of individualism emphasized on self-reliance, self-dependence, and emphasized on individual autonomy. I truly don't understand why Americans, years and years, miles by miles, voluntarily cede their individual autonomy to the state. And I don't understand why somehow raising a kid, the responsibility of raising the kid, somehow they just put that in the hands of the government. I truly don't understand. And so maybe some of you can help me understand why today, I mean, few Americans care about freedom or liberty. I think those liberal media outlets, they even propagate that freedom is overrated. What does that even mean?
I'm going to put together a couple of questions, particularly for Joshua here, that I think go together. One might be put: what kind of signs do you see in your students, the rising generation? Do you see them reacting? Do you see them unreachable with regard to this? What do you see? Are you hopeful when you look at students? That's one question. And a related one is, what's the prospect of a meaningful conversation with, for lack of a better term, the woke faculty and particularly the administrators? Is there a prospect for a conversation, or is it simply impossible to engage them in a way that's constructive or meaningful?
So as to the first question, it's very hard for me to know how to answer the question about what students are like at the moment, because before COVID, I had one of the best teaching years that I've ever had. Everything was absolutely fine and better than fine. And then there was a year and a half of teaching over Zoom, which is just not the sort of conditions under which I or probably anybody else can judge how things really work. And I'm not teaching this semester. So I have not actually taught at Princeton a normal class since the beginning of March 2020. And as I just said, right before then, everything was just fine. I mean, obviously everything was not just fine, but I didn't know it and I didn't feel it in the classroom. As for talking to woke teachers and administrators, well, they won't talk to me. I mean, that sounds funny, but it's entirely true. So I guess I could make more of an effort, but I'm not sure why, as we say in one of the languages that used to be taught in my department, cui bono. I just have no idea. I don't know why I should try to reach out further. I did, at the beginning of this awful saga, try a little bit, and that went nowhere. So am I optimistic? Well, if somebody can solve this problem, that's great, but the problem is not going to be solved by me and for me.
I don't think you can engage wokesters, because what they are after is not engagement. What they're after is dominance, period. So there's just no way to have a dialogue with them, because that's not what they're after. And for the past few years, I've heard lots of criticism coming from conservatives. They keep saying that, you know, those progressives, they are hypocrites. I think hypocrisy is a gross understatement, because when drunk in power, totalitarians have no sense of shame. So just to call them by their true nature, they are way beyond hypocrites. Yeah. So.
But there are reachable people, right? There are people who believe all manner of things, either deeply or not as deeply. And I assume, Mary, that you've had many experiences in your position where you seek to persuade, and you've succeeded in persuading people. How do you reach them? How do you? No, the ones who only want power and decide that any disagreement is a kind of assault on their identity or something else. Putting them aside, isn't there room for persuasion?
I think there is, and really the people that only want power and you can't talk to, I don't talk to. If they talk to me, whether that be on social media or otherwise at the board, they make public comment, I just ignore them. I smile. My mother taught me to always be a lady. But you can't engage those people. It does nothing. And it's actually been kind of challenging to stay smiling while they're saying such, horrible things. But I think there's plenty of people out there that do want to engage, and they do want to learn, and they want to know what to do. And if you get them to coalesce and really care and take part, and they can take it back. And I think there's enough people out there that believe they can take it back. And if we get them all together, I think there's still time. I am hopeful. I am concerned, but I'm very hopeful that there's a lot of people out there that do want to engage.
Okay, this takes us a little afield, but I want to see if I can bring it back to the center piece of education, which is the question about what constitutes truth and lies, and how would we know when someone is teaching a lie or teaching the truth? What would be the criteria? So, this is a question that goes not to education, but to the question about what constitutes a lie. But I want you to maybe put it into the question of what we teach and what we cannot teach. So I'm non-binary, which means I don't identify, I can't read this, with the male or female genders, due to gender being a socially constructed concept. Now, there's a declaration there, so it's a claim to truth, right? So let's keep that in mind, that there's a claim to truth there. Is my identity, my life itself, a lie? And if so, why? Now, the question doesn't go straight to the question of education, but it does go to the question of what do we teach in schools, and how do we deal with competing conceptions of reality? So if gender is socially constructed from one point of view and it's not socially constructed from another point of view, what is the proper role of education in engaging those claims? Is there an empirical way? Is there a logical way? Is it simply a normative claim? How do we navigate competing claims to truth if the goal is to live by truth? I knew that would take us too far afield. I almost didn't do it, but...
Maybe we could go back to the original question, how do we define what is truth? I mean, I think I mentioned this briefly before our conference. I think I see a crucial distinction between two statements. The first statement, that is another catchy sentence nowadays in modern America. What did I say? So I want to live my truth, right? That's one statement. And the second statement is actually our topic today, live in truth. There is a crucial distinction between the two statements. And so first question ought to be addressed is that what is this distinction? What does the first sentence mean when they say, I want to live my truth? And what does it entail? And then how does the second statement respond to the first statement? So maybe we could have a discussion on those around it, centered on those questions.
So I teach some classes in which there really isn't, there aren't really contests about truth. If I teach, say, first semester beginning Latin, and there's a right and a wrong answer to all kinds of basic questions. So this sort of thing doesn't arise. But there are plenty of courses that I teach, and they're often, I think, really very interesting courses in which people do have reasonable disagreements. It's not entirely clear what's going on, because to use this kind of rhetoric, my truth is different from her truth is different from his truth, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We didn't used to call that my truth. It used to be something like, I think, or my feeling is. And that was somehow different from this idea of truth, which is something that everybody was aspiring to. Quite honestly, until a few years ago, I had no problem running large lecture classes as seminars in which I got people to argue with one another. They didn't use phrases like my truth, and they actually were willing to engage in argument. Somehow or other, all of that in the past few years has been eroded, and that's very, very sad. The problem here is I'm not capable of talking about capital T truth. What I think maybe I am capable of talking about is this idea that my truth is not, in most cases, truth. It's something else. It's something like feeling, and feeling isn't truth. Everybody here has feelings. I have feelings, and many of my feelings are not truth, right? I wish, what was it that Rod said before? You know, I wish something were, and that's the way it is. Well, you know, I wish lots of things. I have lots of feelings. Some of those feelings may be good, some of those feelings may be bad, but they're feelings, not truth. Somehow or other, we have to put back into the classroom the distinction between capital T truth, relatively received lowercase t truth, and just gut feelings or not gut feelings, which may get thrown away when the person sitting next to whoever has that feeling says, oh, I disagree, and here's why.
Let me notice, I'm sorry, Mary.
Well, I mean, though, I think the only comment I would make, especially in the K through 12, is that let's talk about education. And let's keep it at that, and let's discuss these other things in the home where our parents teach us.
Well, at the university level, it's difficult to do that, particularly in certain kinds of classes, since I'm not going to teach Latin anytime soon. But in our class this morning, we raised this paradoxical question. Why is it historically that in 1995, in America, among elite institutions, particularly universities, the goal was tolerance, so that if someone says my truth, to use Hobby's language, that I believe that gender is socially constructed, and I live that way, and this is my identity, we would put that under the rubric of accepting different claims to truth. You claim that it's socially constructed. I don't agree, but we tolerate each other, and we go about and we seek to understand our competing moral claims. What's happened since then in universities is that's not an option in most places. You must affirm a truth claim that you do not accept. So in this case, I don't accept that gender is socially constructed. And so if someone says that it is socially constructed, that's the truth in which I live in, I'm supposed to affirm it in most institutions, not tolerate it, not question it, not try to understand the differences among it. How did we get there is an important question. I have one last question before our time is up. This is directed particularly at Professor Katz. Because the curricula is being emptied of core knowledge, and it takes years, if not decades, to develop those skills, how can we preserve our fields of study when our students are not capable of receiving the inheritance we have to offer? I'm thinking, for example, of the removal of Latin Greek requirement in the classics curriculum, or the removal of Western cultural requirements from virtually all GE curricula.
The question is what to do?
Yeah, well, the question is, the actual question is, how do we preserve our fields of study? How do we engage and pass down,
right,
so that we have students who take on the mantle of classics or of history or something whenever the very elements that make possible that inquiry are being undermined at the level of general education or even of majors.
Right. So at the top, just decide now that perhaps it is not essential that your children go to Harvard. But let's say that your children do go to Harvard. If your children go to Harvard, then your children should look for those professors. There aren't many, but there are some who will help them. And that will mean in the classroom, and it will also mean increasingly outside the classroom. And that's then the kind of parallel polis within the polis of all polis, namely Harvard, right? That's how that would work. And before that, well, I mean, that's where the home comes in. If you raise your children with books and stories and history and some attention to truth and perhaps religion, then there's a chance that those children will grow up and will, whether they decide to go to Harvard or not, or whether they're capable of going to Harvard or not, or whether Harvard thinks they're capable of going to Harvard or not, they will end up just fine because they will have the background at home and they will know to seek out the people who can actually help them. We just have to hope that there will continue to be some people at all of these institutions. Meanwhile, I don't know, go to Hillsdale.
Can I add a few words?
Go ahead.
Yeah, I like the last question. So I now recall something Einstein once said I really like. He said, "I did not let education get in the way of my learning." So there is a crucial difference between education and learning, and especially in today's American education, you know, those prestigious institutions, they have transferred education in its traditional sense. In the Latin, in its Latin roots, the word means let out. They have transformed education into a training factory, and to train the next generation of global leaders. And I guess now, if we are thinking about education, and so let's start with learning. Let's start with this beautiful word, learning, and try to lead our soul out of darkness and towards light.
And so, as we adjourn this hobby, are you, as you think about education in America, are you pessimistic? Are you optimistic? Are you hopeful? Which of those describes you?
Oh gosh,
You're pessimistic, I know.
Yeah, I'm by nature a pessimistic person, but somehow my Christian faith does not allow me to be pessimistic about the future. Let me put it in this way: I remain hope. And the hope. I don't know what the hope is, and what I can do is just remain hope, and that's something I see as my duty as being a Christian.
And Joshua, as you face peculiarly daunting circumstances, I'm almost afraid to ask you this question, but I'm going to ask you the same question.
Well, I am a natural pessimist. I am the pessimist of all pessimists. But I wouldn't be here if I didn't have some element of hope. The fact is that people will wake up. I just hope I'm still alive to see it.
And Mary, has Virginia given you hope?
Virginia has absolutely given me hope. I'll be there next weekend. I'm actually, I'll be in Hillsdale tomorrow for a long weekend, and the following weekend I'll be in Virginia, so I'm very hopeful about Virginia. It's exactly what we need, and I look forward to continuing to see it. And I've always been sort of optimistic, but I'm more optimistic than before.
Excellent. Please join me in thanking our panelists.